Hey guys, this is Brian from Starlite Pulp, and this is Starlite Pulpcast. This is for Starlite Pulp review number 3, and so I've got the book here. Obviously, if you look at Sean's screen down there, there's a even bigger picture of it. So thank you, Sean, for that. But this is Starlite Pulp review number 3. We've got a bunch of the authors here from the review, and we're excited to talk a little bit about the stories, about the influences, about the ideas behind it. And so we're going to get started with that right away. By the way, Starlite Pulp Review number 3 came out about a little less than a month ago, and it is available at starlightpulp.com as well as really any of the major outlets, bookshop.org or Barnes & Noble or that Jeff Bezos site or any of those other stuff. So if you guys would pick it up, that would be awesome, especially after listening to these guys talk a little bit. So Jim, I'm going to put you on the spot here, and I'm going to start off with you. You've got a story in here called "Dead Gangsters," and you have a kind of a long and storied history in a lot of ways, both nonfiction and fiction. A lot of punk rock stuff, but then obviously a lot of pulp as well. So, why don't you talk a little bit about "Dead Gangsters" and where that came from?
Yeah, sure. It's funny because I've got the book right here. I was reading this short story collection called "The Dangers of Smoking in Bed" by Mariana Enriquez, and she's a Argentinian writer who had a couple of story collections, and then I think it was last year. I'm not sure when it was originally published, but I think it was translated last year by Megan McDowell. Put out this monster of a book called "Our Share of Night," which I actually read earlier this year and just blew me away. But this one story, the first story in the collection, really grabbed me. It's called Angelita Unearthed, and it's only about 9 pages long. And it has like an almost stereotypical beginning in the sense that it's this large, multi-generational family. It's hard to keep track of all the characters, a lot of domestic stuff going. And except that there's a baby that dies and gets buried in the backyard. And 3 pages, 4 pages into the story, it does this massive swerve. It goes, she forgot all about the baby until she appeared in my apartment 10 years later, crying beside my bed one stormy night. And I was like, wait, 10 years later, the baby's here. I was so enamored by that swerve that I was like, I want to try to do something like that in a story. Um, Except I said it in something closer to home, like in a Irish Catholic family going through, considering the death of the matriarch, basically in Brooklyn, New York. And so that was basically the genesis of the story. Is I just kind of took that idea. I wanted to have a setup and then have something happen, like, several years later, and see if I could build something that the reader would not be like, what is this? And kind of go along with the ride.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, very cool. And yeah, it's a fun read. I when I the first time I read it, I was um I thought, oh, that's a clever idea. So now I see I see where you got it from.
I stole it, but it was funny because well, it's not funny, but when I wrote it, it was still relatively not long after my mother had passed, and it
Ah,
wasn't like in the immediate vicinity, but enough where I was starting to think about it, and it was starting to kind of creep into things I was writing. And so the story, even though there's some humor, there's obviously some horror, but it's also ended up being a story about grief.
mhm. Excellent. All right, man. Well, thank you. Appreciate that. Yeah, Dead Gangsters. Excellent. Manny, let's go over to you. You've got a story in here called Bet, right? And for those that don't know, Manny is has published a few books now on Outcast Press, right? And he is and he uh is it Cabrones Pedos? That's the most recent?
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
the Florida crime novel. Yeah,
Okay.
Cabrones Peters.
And Manny tends to write now, of course, I know that it's not just this, of course, but a lot of the stories recently have been either in Atlanta or Florida. Yeah. And that's where you've spent a good amount of your time. Um
Yeah.
in the last couple of decades anyway. And so and Manny tends to write pretty gritty crime stuff. And so when I got this, I read that and I was like, okay, this falls right, like really smack dab into kind of Manny's, canon, if you will. And so I want you to talk a little bit about that, but I also want to let everybody know that we've got a book. Starlite Pulp has a book of novellas coming out in 24. I'm aiming for fall. We're aiming for fall, but we've got some novellas coming out, and it looks at this point like Alex has one that's in there, as well as Manny, and Aaron possibly as well. We're still talking about that. I'm going to have one. And Manny's novella in that is also a pretty gritty crime little yarn. So Manny, talk about Bet a little bit, would you?
Absolutely. First off, I'm almost intimidated to be in the presence of all of you guys, because I've had 4 books published, through the small presses and all, but to finally have a short story in an anthology, like it's one of those, I'm not worthy, really. Brian, you did a great job in putting this together, and I'm not being biased when I say that the stories in this book, in the review, they're so good. This is some of the best, pulp that I've read in a long time. This is destined to be a classic. So it means the whole world to me to have my little story in there. It's called Bet. It's about 2, I guess they're strippers in Atlanta. And all of my books, they tie in together. They kind of take place in the same universe.
Mm-hmm.
I started writing crime novels when I moved to Atlanta because the crime here is ridiculous. So it was very inspirational. Plus, I lived in Florida, and I was, I've had drug dealer friends since I was a kid. So it was always a thing. I've never been a criminal. I've never even shoplifted, but I knew some people, and they've stayed with me. So their ghosts I don't mean literal ghosts, but their stories and their personalities have stayed. So I have written a lot of crime novels. I used to work with this woman. Her name was Amicia, and I've spoken to her. I told her, "Hey, you inspired a story," and I let her read it, and she loved it. And her and a friend, when I used to work with them in an office, they would sit in their car and just talk and talk. And sometimes I'd sit and listen to them. And so that's where a lot of the story Bet came from. A lot of their conversations. I wanted to do like the movie The Players Club meets Yojimbo, where the two sides are put against each other. That's it. That's the story, and everything else is conversations that I overheard. So
excellent.
Yeah.
But I mean that's kind of the thing, right? About a lot of crime. And I'm not saying that stories don't need to be original. Of course they should be original, but the fact of the matter is that if it's really well done with a premise we've seen before, it doesn't really matter. As long as the content, the conversations, the characters are all there and they're believable and they're something that we can sink our teeth into, that's really all it takes, right? I mean, we're not trying to reinvent the wheel here,
Yeah. What was it? Borges said there's only 2 narrative types: the resurrection and the Odyssey. And I think we're all still writing those same stories over and over. So, but yeah, just really great stories in the book. I'm still reading them. I'm not done yet, but I can't pick a favorite because it's a perfect blend of pulp and crime and horror. The one about the wasps, I'm not gonna sleep well. I'm never gonna sleep this well after that ever. So yeah,
That's
I'm just
awesome.
proud to be part of it. Absolutely.
Excellent, man. Well, I appreciate that. But Bet fits right in there, man. That's a really solid story. So excellent. Brody,
You.
Let's go over to you real quick. And I want to talk about this. You have a Locust Eater in here. And Locust Eater is the first story in the book, because one of the things I try to do with each one of these issues, and this is no joke, like I set out to do this. there's always a story that I'm looking for that I think to myself, okay, I want a first story. Like I want that story to lead off and to have readers go, huh. Because in if you recall in number two, it was a story about an alternate retelling of the murder of JFK. That's how that book opens up. And in this one of the things I really liked about Locust Eater from the get-go was just how weird it was. It was like it kind of reminded me of a Twilight Zone episode and and I enjoyed that. And I, the first few pages I'm getting into it, I'm like, okay, yeah. And then you get into the preacher and a little bit of that going on. You've got the tattoo, and then all of a sudden you get to the house and you've got the weirdness of the characters there. And then I certainly don't want to spoil any plot points, so I won't do that. But once Big Man starts moving, it's like, oh. So it was it's a fun story. It's a weird one. So why don't you tell us a little bit about it?
Well, thank you for including it. I had a lot of fun with it, and I did read an article where you said you try and put the stories together like one would do an album. So when I opened it up and I saw it was first one, I was like, "Whoa, that's pretty cool." Um, so with Locust Eater, I wanted the the preacher to actually, the healer to actually physically confront the infirmed. And I thought about Flannery O'Connor's Greenleaf. I wanted the bull to be embodied in a man and not an animal. I wanted there to be a tattoo, like Parker's back. Um, I knew that they were going to meet. As far as Johnny's character, I could see, early influences like the "Hey you guys" guy from Goonies. Um, and I wanted, as Levi and his mother were driving down the switchbacks, I wanted the van that was transporting them to this other world to already be accessible for Johnny. I didn't want him to have to open doors to get to Levi. I knew that when he was going to start rolling, like you said, it was going to be a snowball effect. I went to Western Carolina. I had Charles Dodd White as my professor my freshman year. And he spoke a lot about themes of cannibalism. But I understand what that means symbolically. And so, with the whole tattoo and what Johnny likes to eat, with those two married, I wanted Levi to become the bread, so to speak. Whereas he thought he was going to be the rescuer or the healer.
Right.
Everything shifts, and he's unable to finish the quote of the Bible verse. But the last word, the one word that he can't say, are the letters in his own name if you scramble them around. And so, I wanted that. But, in the word live, is his own realization, possibly, of who he might be, of who he really is. But I had a lot of fun with it. I was skeptical about it because of its supernatural type Twilight Zone elements, but I'd already started entering that highly imaginative place because I was like starting to write the Oz prequel.
We're very comfortable with that realm anyway.
Nice. So yeah, man, I enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun.
Well, it's you know, this is one of the reasons why I love having these is you can see every writer's different. Every single one of us here, I guarantee you, is different. The process is different. The way we go about it is different. The idea generation is different. All of it. But just the depth of thought that you put into a lot of that, I guarantee you, half the people here are like, oh, I, I've started stories with not even a fifth of that, where I'll just start off with a character and a situation and just go. And so the amount of connections that you've got going on right there, you can tell is, really at the kind of the forefront of how the story comes across. And that's cool.
Well, thank you, man. It's got to be stimulating for me so that I can enjoy writing it. But I'm glad that it came across like that. Thank you.
Absolutely. Good, man. Well, happy to have you and happy to have the story, man. It's excellent. Let's go over to Aaron. Aaron Paul Schaut. You've got the Depression of John Stonebrook in here, and when I originally read the story, you sent it, and I sent you something back, telling me that it reminded me of a Western meets the Twilight Zone. And that's kind of because of the progression and the radio that doesn't really make sense, and the almost time travel in a sense that the characters are undergoing. So it's an interesting progression. And what's funny is, I'm not even gonna lie to you, you have to understand when we read these, Jake and myself, and I've got another editor that helps out too, we're reading hundreds of stories, literally hundreds. So I'm not going to lie to you. I read this the first time, and it took a couple things didn't make sense to me, and they didn't make sense because I wasn't following closely enough. And then one of the other editors was like, "Well, did you see this?" And I was like, "Oh shit, okay, let me go back and take a look." And then I was like, "Oh, okay, yeah, no, I see it now. Oh, the lights flickering." Before it was candles, now there's lights. Okay. So, talk a little bit about the Depression of John Stonebrook, where it came from, and I don't know what you think about the story.
Well, first, I'd like to say I'll follow Manny and say I am honored to be amongst you guys. It's kind of like if I started playing guitar and Off came to town and invited me to come play with him. So it's pretty cool to be here with you guys. The Depression John Stonebrook. I knew I wanted to submit something, and I knew I wanted to submit something that was both country or Western and science fiction. So I didn't have to think too hard about that, and I can give you kind of a little bit of a story as to where that came from. My father passed away during COVID, and I had to go up and visit him to kind of care for him before things really hit the storm, or things went downhill. And he couldn't get around, so he spent a lot of time just sitting in front of the TV. And one of his big things was always Gunsmoke. So we sat there for days and days watching Gunsmoke and Wanted Dead or Alive and all these shows. And he looked at me one time and he said, these aren't. There's nothing fancy about these. They're just nice stories. And I thought, and so when I sat down to write a Western / sci-fi, I thought, I'm just going to write a nice story that kind of feels like a Gunsmoke or something like that. And I was sitting here and I was thinking about it, and I believe it or not, this caught my eye. I always sit and look at this little radio sitting on my shelf, and it came to me that what happens is somebody from the past finds a little radio like this, like somebody from Gunsmoke. I was also a big fan of the movie The Homesman, Tommy Lee Jones. I like his dry character and how he just kind of it just had a feeling to it. So I kind of wanted this dry character to stumble across something from the future. And that kind of triggered me. And from there, the story kind of wrote itself. I will say that what really hooked me on this was you see a lot of Westerns But what you don't see a lot of is a lot of westerns that are involved in, say, the Upper Peninsula, Michigan, Wisconsin, right, where somebody's traveling, a homesteader's traveling, maybe there's a little Civil War involvement. So I got really excited doing the research on this, looking up and seeing what his Civil War history would be, what would have happened to his wife and child. This is John Stonebrook, and what would have led him to do the things he did. So I delved into a lot of newspapers, stuff like that, which really made writing this story interesting.
Excellent. Yeah. And you're absolutely right. When it comes to no bullshit, when it comes to Westerns, we act like anything above like Virginia doesn't exist until you get over to maybe North Dakota, South Dakota. But you know, it's just from the whole back east all the way across the Midwest, we just don't. The stories don't even get told. You know, it's just everything is something starts in the South. And I say this literally right now, writing a novella that starts in Texas and ends in California. So I mean, I'm just as guilty of it as everybody else. I'm just saying that with quote unquote Old West stories, we tend to ignore the back east, essentially. You know,
well, you know, it's hard. I'll admit it's hard too, because you know what, that old Western thing is so cool. Like, who doesn't want to write about that? Obviously, the Midwest is probably not as cool, but it can be, and I guess that's the point.
Excellent. Yeah. Okay, good. Let's go over to Terrence here. Terrence, with your story in here, you are very much kind of a when you sent it, it cracked me up. Like literally just a couple pages into it, I was laughing because I know you a little bit, and it's so you. You you have a penchant for you know, 007 and secret agents and that kind of thing, and this kind of falls right into that category. Granted, there's a twist, obviously, towards the end and all that, but in terms of the you know, kind of the basic story plotline characterization, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so Terrence. So so talk a little bit about Fairy Tale Mission.
So the Venn diagram of my brain is James Bond, Indiana Jones, and Godzilla. And that's kind of the premise I started with. I have been trying to find this image somewhere, and I can't, of Sean Connery in Tokyo with like a Godzilla statue staring at him in black and white. It must exist somewhere because other people have seen it too, but I just can't find it. So I have been rewatching Godzilla movies, and I was like, yo, Godzilla versus James Bond, that would be cool. Two 60s icons. And I knew that I wanted to write a story for this review number 3, which again, just honored to be a part of it. I wanted to write it for fun and was like, you know what? If they take it, they take it. Great. If not, I'll just save it for something else later. And so that was that nexus. That was the initial start there. And then it just kind of spiraled. Initially, the plan had been just straightforward spy versus unknown question mark. And the more, by like my second draft, I had a friend look at it and he's like, are you purposely trying to write a fairy tale? And I was like, oh, no. But then I leaned a little bit more into what is the fairy tale structure. And so there is basically this evil wizard who tries entombing him essentially. And I love Bond stuff, as the poster behind me probably proves, along with me being in my suit, all that kind of stuff. So I also wanted to have a torture scene in it that was like a very specific from the start, because Fleming's books, all the James Bond canon, there's usually one very good torture scene. The best example people know of, it comes from Casino Royale because they put that into the movie. Thankfully, I did not beat my main character's balls nearly as much as Fleming did, but that was the intent there.
Excellent. Yeah. Yeah. No, it just cracked me up. I read it and I'm like, I liked it through and through. I liked the twist at the end. We talked about it a little bit. We went back and forth on it a little bit, but yeah, it just seems so right up your alley. It kind of cracked me up.
Succeeded on every level.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. All right, let's go over to Alex. Alex, you wrote Snowbird in this, and Snowbird is the last piece because and the reason I did that is because I put it there is because it kind of, I don't know, it seemed like a last song to me. It's slightly a little bit longer than some of the others, which is not uncommon for last songs on albums. And I thought, it just seems like it was also the only thing we ever debated with Snowbird, Jake and myself and our other editor. The only thing I ever debated about it was, is it pulp enough? That was what we talked about. It because right from the get-go, it's like, oh, this is an excellent story. I like this a lot. But it's modern day, it's more military, merc work. It definitely has that cut. It definitely has like a neo-Western feel to it, no doubt about that. But so there were all these kind of earmarks that were super cool. But yeah, it's just it's a joy. And for those of you who are going through the book who haven't gotten to it yet, Snowbird is the last story, and it's top notch. So Alex, what talk to us about that?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. And yeah, and no, it's an honor not to just to be included in this, but also to close out the volume. I just finished it actually the other day, and I was like, wow, this is kind of nice to see how everything flows together. And then with Snowbird, it seems like a good ending for the whole volume. I felt so, and I was like, oh, it's an honor to be that. Yeah, Snowbird is about it's about some ex-special forces guys who were part of a multinational contingent in the war in Afghanistan, and they go down to the border, to the Arizona-Mexico border, to take out one of their former comrades who's now training up cartel hitmen. And the reason that I wanted to write about this was I'm always fascinated by frontiers. I'm always fascinated by borders and what can go on there, probably since reading Blood Meridian, which is like my favorite book. And so I got thinking, because I come down to Arizona a lot. I'm usually in Canada, but I've been coming down here for over a decade now. And I always kind of thought, okay, well, there's lots of Canadian snowbirds that come down here to get away from the cold and to enjoy the heat and just relax. And I thought, what if somebody came down here not to relax, but because this is a hostile environment? It's hot. It's got, deadly wildlife. What if somebody started to enjoy that? And so I started centering it around a character who's a Canadian Special Forces military commando, basically, who's come down for that reason. And as I was thinking about it, I also started getting some inspiration from Don Winslow's Cartel trilogy, which is a terrific 3-volume set that I love. And I kind of picked up a few different things here and there in terms of not just the tone and flow of Winslow's work, but little things like I was talking. Well, my best friend and I, we like to quote "The Hunt for Red October" to each other a lot, and so I think one day we were talking to each other, and one of us just said, "We're going to kill a friend," and that became sort of the impetus for creating the story of what would bring these special forces guys down to the border, to exercise some violence. It's got to be more than just, there's bad guys there. There's got to be some personal stakes in it. And as I was writing it and starting to structure the story and connecting the modern day with the historical Old West and with the nature of war and conflict along the border, I started realizing that I was partially writing something that was an homage to one of my favorite Westerns, The Professionals from 1966. And so it took on a little bit of that neo-Western flavor. And ultimately, I knew I wanted to have things go down in an Old West ghost town, which, there's a few of those kind of around, and they fascinate me. I just went to one yesterday, actually. And and so that's kind of where everything leads to. And I really wanted to create a story that blended that Old West and the new Western sensibilities. Also something that talked a little bit about some things that veterans are thinking. Like some of the characters and some of the things they say are based on conversations I've had with guys who've been to Afghanistan and Iraq, who've been part of multinational coalitions, and I always found that really interesting that they had these sort of unique perspectives on what it meant to be a team and what it meant to be part of a brotherhood, and all that sort of informs Snowbird.
Yeah, and one of the things I find that kind of captured me when I read it is it really deals with kind of the ethical concerns of what one of their old group is doing, right? It's not, it's more than a right or wrong thing. It's almost like breaking an unwritten rule, right? Which is like, we know this stuff, but we're not supposed to go teach it to just anybody because we can. Right. That's especially when they're on the, quote unquote, wrong side. Right. Like that's something that, you're kind of breaking a rule there that we don't talk about, but we all acknowledge that it's there.
Yeah. Something that's sort of intimately understood. And the idea that some of the guys who took part in some of these military operations see it and view it as they did something that, helped people sleep at night, that protected whether it was democracy or homelands. And so to know that one of their own comrades has gone and decided to just help perpetuate this cycle of conflict is almost an embedded, like an inherently felt betrayal. And so I wanted to explore that a fair bit with it. And the interesting thing too is that, like, if you think about some of the old Westerns and sort of the post-Civil War Western, they touch on themes like that as well. So I think it was a good mechanism to do that.
Outstanding. Yeah, no, I agree. Excellent. And thank you, Alex. Let's go over to Pat for the next one. And Pat, you've got zombie wasps from hell ! In here. And we've gone, Pat and I have reached out. We've been talking for probably a year and a half on Instagram. We send each other messages and stuff just because I've watched some of the Dead Headspace stuff, and we kind of talk a little bit about podcasting, getting some ideas back and forth. If does he know this person? Do I know that person? That kind of thing. In terms of the shows, although it's certainly more me asking him than him asking me. But he sent me the story a while back, Zombie Wasp, and so we worked on it back and forth a little bit because there were some things in it in the first draft where I was like, why don't we, what if we do this here? Why don't we? And I know on here, and I'm really happy for you about this. I know a few different people have expressed to me that this is one of their favorite stories in the issue, and cool. And so talk to us a little bit about Zombie Wasp from Hell, where it came from, idea generation, the weirdness of it. One thing before you get started, I apologize, caveat here. There is one thing I always try to do also with these issues, and this is something I don't even ask my other editors. Like literally, this is just a me, myself, and I thing, like De La Soul. And I sit here, and there's a couple of stories every issue that I want that are just straight up fun pulp. Like that's it. Just they don't need to, they don't need to be things that are, gonna win literary awards and crap like that. They're just things that are just fun pulp that I could see in a 40s pulp mag, And Zombie Wasp was one of those where I'm getting it and I'm just like, you know what? I love the concept from this. I love the title. Just the title is funny. And so it is something that you can imagine on the back of a cereal box or on the back of in a comic, right, that you're reading in the 40s or 50s. And so I just want to say that first and foremost, because this is one of those stories that just like it's so classic pulp in so many ways, and I appreciate that. So Pat, you're on.
Thank you. First off, I was not sure from the time that you accepted the story to when I gave back notes, because I wrote this like 3 or 4 years ago. As everyone knows here, you evolve as a writer, and from 2019 to now, I've jumped with immense steps from when I started really focusing on writing in 2013. And I look back and I'm like, I'm not sure why they picked this because I see, like, I'm an editor too, so I saw all my mistakes. That's all of us. But I pointed all those out in a way too many notes, and I was just thinking he's not going to take this now. So when you did, I was really happy, and I I've had anthologies. I've been in somewhere there's no editing at all, which is bizarre. Um, there's somewhere the editors are so. This is one of the better ones, for sure, because you guys gave really poignant notes, um, and you point out a lot of stuff that any editor will make a story better, and I appreciate that. And like everyone else expressed, I'm really grateful to be in here with all the fellas, and I just I think it's a cool mythology. I mean, it says it on the back. You got westerns, horror, sci-fi, crime, pulp of all kinds. So the story idea came from I love Creepshow, the first two movies, and I even like the newer shows. Um, I I love, as you can tell, Star Wars too, and Lord of the Rings, and a bunch of other stuff. And I bring that up because I don't ever go online and start fighting with people about what I like and why I think everyone else is wrong. And I just sometimes like, well, all the time, probably like with was it Terrence love for 007. I like I think of Creepshow a lot because it's just fun and it brings me back to, like, I watched that when I was, I don't know, 13 or when I was younger. It was, I got it on DVD. So I'm a 90s kid, so it came out way before I was born. But it's just it's movies like that that reminds me, this is why, like, I write horror, but I also write crime and other things, But this is why I do this in the first place, because I want to never lose that imagination, that creativity, things that I try to pass on to my boys. And I just wanted to write a story that was like something you could find in Creepshow, and my wife's immense fear for hornets. Um, Sometimes I'm not nice about it, and I kind of laugh, and I, you know, I, I guess I'm a jerk for that, but uh, it just combined into one thing, and I'm like, well, what if they were? I don't know why. We never know why. We have certain seeds in our heads that pop up, but I'm like, well, what if they were zombies? And I just, I worked at a grocery store, and I thought, well, that'd be kind of neat if you kind of reverse the expectations of parents that want their kids to have a serious job that they want to do. It's usually aimed towards people that want to do something artistic, which is insane because, like, what was, like, guys like Stan Lee doing? They live most of their life creating stories, and that's what I think all of us are doing. And in this case, I had the parents that had a son that was obsessed with bugs because I think bugs are creepy, and they skeeved me out. Um, and I forget what the term is, but kind of taking the science route of it, where his parents wanted him to do something like Richard Parker or Don Winslow. I think I wrote those two authors actually in that. Huge Don Winslow fan, by the way. Yeah, he's great. And I was like, that'd be interesting. You got two kind of artsy parents that are really just determined to have their kid be like them. And that's great and all, but it can get, not to preach or anything, but it can get really, that could get really ugly really fast if you really push it and don't let your kid expand on and explore who they are. Um, so I kind of just let that go free where the kid just buys magazine, buys something harmless. It's just a goofy name. It's a silly name that makes you laugh when you think of it. And nope, they're real and they kill the parents. And I don't think that really, maybe that spoils it. But what happens next was actually your idea, Brian. Um, you suggested kind of stick to a lighter sense of humor than going dark, which I guess I went way too dark with the original draft, and I'm like, yeah, you're right. And how it ends, I don't want to spoil it, but how it ends, that was because of your suggestions, and that's pretty much it. I just had fun with it, and I want to write a lot of stories like that, where it's just something that you can just take your mind off of whatever struggles you're dealing with in real life and get lost in a silly, over the top story.
Yeah, exactly. No, and that's exactly it. And that's, I mean, I think first off, I speak for almost everybody here, certainly not everybody, but almost everybody in saying that Creepshow was awesome. And that
Yeah.
and it impacted almost all of our lives in some way, shape, or form. And the whole concept of it reminds me of something. I mean, everybody here of a certain age remembers the sea monkeys, the sea monkey ads, right? In the comic books and things like that. And that's what the zombie wasp reminds you of, like right off the bat. That's
Yeah, exactly.
it's like, oh, it's like a little chia pet. Oh, you just give it water and it grows. And of course, 3/4 of the time it doesn't work. But in this case, it does, to very harmful effect.
And I tried to keep I don't know if I did it successfully or not, but I tried to keep the narration in I don't even know if I like said how old he was. I'm pretty sure he's like 8 to 10, but I wanted to keep it in like that kind of intellectual level where he mentions that rags between the Playboy bunny, and he's like, I forget how I worded it, but he was just not interested in that, not interested in the sports magazine. And I mean, I don't know about you guys, but that I was like that as a kid. I was just into like video games, going outside. I like sports too, but I don't know, I was too young for thinking of girls and stuff like that. So I I tried to do that, and when you mix that with like the pressures of some parents just kind of bearing down on you with their expectations. I think that's kind of like reflected with the zombie wasps. And I'm just realizing that as I'm saying that right now. So I don't even know I meant to do that.
See all the
Yeah.
tie-ins?
What's that?
See all the tie-ins? Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
that's how it works.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Thank you,
All right,
sir.
man. Let's go over to Sean. Sean, you've got a story in here called Pit, right? And it was one of those that grabbed me right off the bat when I read it. Same thing with Jake when Jake saw it, because I'm gonna be honest with you, we don't see many cockfighting stories, and that's not a thing. Like there's no subgenre of cockfighting, and so I was like, okay, this is interesting, this is fun. And then when you brought in, what I really liked about it is obviously the main dude and his cock are the kind of perennial winners, as it were, as we find in the story. But when you bring the Mexican contingent in, I really liked that aspect as well, because it all of a sudden brings up this very kind of us versus them concept when you bring in cockfighting, rural Missouri and Arkansas. All of a sudden there's all of these other kind of conflict based aspects that come in. And obviously, I don't want to ruin the story or anything like that, but a lot of mayhem ensues. And so that's a lot of fun. I enjoyed that quite a bit. Not to mention the fact that, of course, the guy, and I'm forgetting his name, the protagonist, well, I guess he's
Junie Kruger.
There you go. So he's a bit of a douche.
Mm-hmm.
Also,
Yeah,
just in general. So yeah, it's a fun story. So how about it? And first off, where did the cockfighting aspect come from, and then go from there?
Well, so most of the stories I've written, I've written for years, and even though I haven't lived there, I grew up in rural Missouri, and for better or worse, I just can never stop going to that well. Growing up there, I saw many things, saw many different worlds that don't see in, LA. That's where I live now. So a lot of my stories just sort of take place in rural Missouri or rural Arkansas. So the way the cockfighting came about is I personally, for better or worse, I'm always fascinated by blood sport worlds. I'm really into bullfighting. I've been to bullfighting in Mexico and Spain. I'm an avid hunter. But cockfighting itself, I was in high school and there was a guy, I worked at a lumber yard for a summer. And there's a guy who was, I don't know, he was probably 3 or 4 years older than me. And he had a farm in the backwoods. And one day he's like, "Hey, why don't you come out and see my chickens, man?" I was like, "All right." He's told me all about cockfighting. So I went to his house and he's got like 200 roosters, and hens and little chicks. And they're just like, the little chicks were just fighting one another out in the yard as he fed them. I was like, "God, this is pretty crazy." And then, years passed and actually went to a cockfight in Mexico a couple of times. And again, however you feel about blood sport, they're fascinating. But the story itself, the way it came about, its genesis for Pitt, actually, there was a true story where there was a big raid about, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago in a place called De Queens, Arkansas. So the idea of that raid, and there were Mexican immigrants that were there, that, they did get in a lot of trouble along with a lot of other places, because cockfighting itself has been outlawed in all 50 states, I believe, since 2007. That was sort of the idea of like, hey, I can really tap into this world that I'm fascinated with and write about it. I can talk a little bit about Missouri, and let me just kind of shoot off and make sort of this asshole character that sort of gets his comeuppance with these immigrants from Mexico that came up from Arkansas, and that's how the chaos ensues. So
Yeah, excellent. And you know what? I gotta say, I think it's impossible to write a cockfighting story that doesn't have a ton of sexual innuendo.
yeah,
But I feel like you really embrace it in
I
this.
did.
And,
The puns, I couldn't help with the little humor there. You're right about it.
so watching you read this live last week was hilarious, because you were just constantly referring to his bloody cock and
Yep.
his raising his cock up and everybody celebrating his cock, and it
Yeah.
was it is something to behold.
Yeah, well, you gotta put a little humor there. Yeah, another influence too that had a little humor to it was Charles Willeford's book, and also the movie Cockfighter with Warren Oates in it. That was kind of an influence too. I love that world, and it has some humor to it. You're gonna have to use cock in there somewhere or another. So.
I mean, you have to kind of embrace it, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
Excellent. Excellent. Good. Okay, let's go over to Trevor. And Trevor, you excuse me, you wrote 1974 Monte Carlo in here, and you write consistently the Trinity novels, correct?
That's right.
Okay. And so you've got how many of those now?
Let's see. I think there's 6 of in the Trinity series,
Okay.
and I got a few standalones.
Okay. And 1974 Monte Carlo kind of fills this space for me that I think Jake, I sent the story to Jake, I read it, I enjoyed it, I sent it to Jake, and he essentially sent back, and you know this because he's contacted you as well, but he essentially sent back, "I love this story. It totally reminds me of Elmore Leonard." And I think everybody here would say, well, that's not a bad thing to be compared to. And so it does have that feel to it where it's not particularly, it's crime for sure, not particularly violent, a lot of dialogue, and the dialogue is sharp, and it kind of deals with these characters who are a little off base, and as so many Leonard characters oftentimes are. And so why don't you talk to us a little bit about 74 Monte Carlo?
Oh, well, thanks again. Thanks for including me. Thanks for taking the story. And this is a blast hearing the backstories from all you guys, how you came up with the stories. And and so on and so forth. This is a real treat because you don't get to hear that all the time, right?
Right.
You know, you read something and it's in a vacuum, and you go, "Ah, that was great," but guy that wrote it's not open to correspondence, perhaps. But anyway, this is different, so that's good. When I thought, well, I'll submit something, and I always start with characters. So I don't know which one. I believe it had to be Earl was the old sales guy.
Yep.
In the story. So I'll start with characters. I lived most of my life, I guess, most of my life I lived in Arizona, in Tucson, at the Tucson, and then up in the mountains in near Pine Top, so on. Incidentally, Alex, you included. I was pleased to see that you included the Casa Grande Monument in your story, and that was pretty cool because that is I was going. You go in Coolidge, Arizona. I lived there for a little bit, so anyhow, I always put it in a place. I tend to go to the same spots. Funny enough, in this one, I wanted to start. It was going to be a road. It was going to be a road crime thing, sort of a road adventure, but didn't work out that way. The character of Tawny became, AKA Tawny, became more. She came more to the forefront. And then I like the idea of, well, I have a standalone called Dim Lights, Thick Smoke, where I have the sort of like a, what's that song? The road goes on forever and party never ends. It's sort of like that ending, which is a nice way to, you know, have things go off into the sunset. But anyhow, it started with the characters, as it always does. I try and include, like you say, you're talking about the dialogue, trying to cut away excess unnecessary description. I like to include topical, or I like to include references to place, as in some of the places people who are familiar with Tucson might be familiar with some of the spots or recognize them in a thinly disguised way. What else? Oh yeah, I like to include elements from the time period involved, which is usually like mid 70s to mid 80s. Everything's got to happen in my stories or my novels before the fall of the Berlin Wall. That's kind of like the spot.
Gotcha.
So that's the world in which I live, and from there, just kind of wrote. I pared it down. They no longer were going to start up around upstate New York, Buffalo area. It all took place in Tucson, which makes it, or mostly takes place in Tucson a little bit. They allude to being down into the southern part of the state and the Benson and these kind of places Alex is talking about, and then that's how it ends. So appreciate you including it, and you know, anytime that anybody mentions Elmore Leonard in my name, I get all excited. But
right,
he's the man, and you know, it's like I have the pantheon there, or the Mount Rushmore. He'd definitely be included on it, along with when Westlake's writing is Richard Stark, and probably George V. Higgins and a couple others. But those are my guys.
Yeah, excellent. Excellent. All right, good. Thank you. And so we've only got Phillip left, and then I'll very briefly after that say something about the story I wrote in here, and then we'll get to a little Q&A. But Phillip, you wrote is it rat or rats? I forget.
Rats,
plural. And you wrote rats in here, and rats is one of those that, like I was mentioning earlier, in my mind at least, it's one of those where we were talking about in the first little bit of not reinventing the wheel. It's a good, solid, taut crime yarn. Just period. End of story. And there's nothing excess in it. There's nothing particularly over the top in it. It's just well written, well structured, and just well done from start to end. So talk to us a little bit about Rats.
Okay, but first of all, thank you for that. It's always nice to hear kind words, and it really is a privilege to be in this issue. This is the strongest issue so far, at least in my opinion. Great stories, and it's great to have a chance to sit down with a group of writers, because we spend so much of our time locked in a room somewhere, keeping the world at bay. So, but yeah, this story. It's been a while since I've written a short story, and once I put my latest novel, Not Dead Enough, once I got that put to bed, I said, okay, I'll take a little bit of a break, take a breath, and I came across a collection of short stories by Ed McBain, and I didn't realize it when I picked it up, but it's called Learning to Kill, and it's a collection of some of his very, very early pulpy short stories that he wrote, 40s and 50s. And it's sort of a little clinic of how he learned the craft of writing crime stories. So that was probably the immediate motivation. And then, the other thing is I don't typically write in first person. I don't think I'm very good at it, and it's always a challenge for me to do it. So I said, okay, I'm gonna see what I come up with. And then there's the unreliable narrator aspect of it, which McBain did a good job of exploring in his book. And I used to hate them, but now I really enjoy unreliable narrators because they're unpredictable. I think as humans, maybe there's a little bit of that in all of us. We sometimes we act like we're acting for the greater good, or I'll help you out, and I'll do it in a very selfless kind of way. And we're really hiding a bad motive under a good motive. And so I thought, okay, well, let's push this around a little bit. And I enjoyed hearing Sean talk. Me too. I go back to the place that formed me. So this, the story takes place in rural East Mississippi, where I grew up, and where all of my novels tend to take place. Right there on the Alabama-Mississippi state line, which is its own mysterious little weird world of crossing back and forth between the state lines to stay out of whichever police jurisdiction you might be in at the time. And like Manny said earlier, I'm not a criminal. So some of my friends were criminals. So it's nice to kind of go in there and stir that pot a little bit. But I just wanted to see, okay, if you have an unreliable narrator and he's in this particular situation, doesn't have a lot of resources. There's not a big world for him to live in. It's a very rural, small town place in a corner of the country that nobody's ever heard about. And he's presented with a situation. Let's drop him in the middle of it and then see how he reacts to it and see what he does. And my intent was to write a fast-paced, straight-up criminal yarn. The first line of the story literally came to me when it was 4:30 in the morning. I'm in the back of a van going down the highway doing 80 miles an hour. And as soon as I had that thought, I was like, yeah, but it's not what I think it is. And I just wrote it down and I put it away. And then, a few months later, I came back to it. And sometimes it happens that way. Most times it doesn't. But I had to go back and find that and dig it up, because what did I say when I was going to work that one day?
Right.
And I pulled it back out and looked at it and I said, okay, I got this. Now what do I do with it? And I usually don't operate that way. I'm sure people, everybody here has done the same thing. There have been times when I've written the last paragraph of the story first. And didn't realize that it was the last paragraph, but it ended up being that way. In this case, the opposite was true. I was able to get the first line down, and then, throw in some of the things in that story actually happened. Some of them are just purely made up, but there's a couple of things in there that I was able to pull back on, and it was a really good break, and I was really grateful that when you read it, you took it for it. So I do appreciate the opportunity to be in there and, just to write a good old crime yarn for once without having having to worry about, deadlines or word count or anything like that. So thanks.
Absolutely. Excellent. Good. Yeah. First off, I just want to point out to everybody, I'm sure everybody's probably already noticed it, but if you haven't, Don Winslow, for whatever reason, keeps coming up today. And we see a Don Winslow book right near Philip's head over here. And that Ed McBain book that's up there too. And then I also want to touch on the unreliable narrator thing for a second, because I feel the same way as you do. First person, sometimes I feel like first person can be the most striking, if you will, of the tenses if you use it correctly. But at the same time, bad first person is not great for sure. But there's also this thing about the unreliable narrator that's frustrating sometimes because you feel like you're being lied to.
Right.
Funny enough. But at the same time, it can work both ways, because we've all watched that movie, right? Where somebody's playing a character and that character you hate so much. And then you realize all they're really doing is the character's well written and the actor's performing it well. It has nothing to do with that person, right? You just want to see them get that comeuppance, whether it comes or not, because of how well that character is performing, even though you can't stand them. I feel a little bit of the same way with the unreliable narrator, which is that sometimes it's easy to get frustrated and say, hey, wait a minute, I feel like I'm being cheated. But at the same time, it's usually because they're doing it well.
Mm-hmm.
And that's important, because, obviously it's something that, because it is easy to, my first experience, as I'm sure a lot of people's in here, or at least the first time the unreliable narrator was kind of pushed in my face, right, was Catcher in the Rye, because I was in school and it's like introduced to you, right? Teachers like, this is an example of unreliable narrator, right? Holden Caulfield, not reliable.
Right.
And so, and I remember not liking Holden in the book. Like when I read it, I didn't like Holden. And I didn't know if I was supposed to or not at the time. I was in, 10th grade, 9th grade, whatever. But I didn't like him. But the unreliable narrator thing is interesting because it's something that you kind of carry with you as a writer, because all of us are insatiable readers, I would assume. And you run into these books sometimes where you might really like the book, you don't necessarily like the narrator that much, right? If it's first person. And so it's this kind of funny paradox dichotomy. So yeah, it is interesting when you how many people here, just by a show of hands, how many people write in first person quite a bit?
Wow.
Yeah.
That surprises me for some reason.
Yeah. And I think, a funny thing is, I also think that writing in first person in a funny way feels risky, because you're writing first person and you're saying I, even though it's not you still have this thing of, even if it's subconscious level, people are going to think I'm writing this, that this is me, right? As opposed to, and that's one of the things, by the way, that's one of the things that made The Killer in Me by Thompson so volatile at the time. It wasn't that the small town sheriff is going around killing people. It's that it was written first person. So all of a sudden it's, I did this. I fooled her into thinking this, and then I smashed her fucking head in. Like that. And that was the thing that creeped people out. It wasn't the small town sheriff doing bad things. That happens all the time. It was I'm the small town sheriff doing bad things that people were like, oh, wait a minute, and so I think there is a little bit of that kind of a stigma about it, right? Is if you do it really well, there's a creepiness to it. Right? Is that fair?
That is fair, I believe.
All right, excellent. So I'm just going to say a word or two about my story in here. It's called Lullaby for the Damned. I got to be honest with you guys. I swear to God, I think I went through 20 different titles for this. Lullaby for the Damned was the title I came up with the day or the day before I was putting the book together. No bullshit. It had probably 15 titles before that. I mean, I had, I really like titles. I like playing around with titles. When I first started out but back when dinosaurs were around, when I first started writing, it was I started out in poetry, so titles were always important in that aspect. And so, I mean, I had so many things on this. And I had Ghost Town Blues, I had Laughter the Mutilated, I had just a ton of things. The story in the last review was called At Play with the Wasted Gods. I really kind of like playing around with titles. Lullaby for the Damned literally was like, fuck it. Okay, just slap that on it and let's go. But this is a character named Rye Lonehand. He's half Irish, half Pawnee, and he's a bounty hunter that I got the idea for of just, and I don't know where I got the idea, honestly, but he's a guy I've written a few stories with so far, and he's fun because what he does is he doesn't have any official capacity, but what he does is he essentially travels across tribal lands, native lands, handling things on tribal lands that the white marshals don't want to deal with. So they essentially kind of hire him out as a contractor to handle things on tribal lands and bring those things back. And was that a real position? I have no idea. I just literally was like, that sounds like a cool idea. Fuck it. I'm going to go with that. And because that's the nice part about this stuff, right? We can come up, we can do all the research we want. We can make everything as historically accurate as possible. But if we want to change something or make it up, we just do that, right? And so that's what he is. So he's got this guy that he lives with sometimes, who's his Irish cousin, but he's full Irish and massively disrespects the fact that Rye is half native. And I say at one point they share blood alone, because they really don't like each other. They don't see many, things to bond over, but at the same time, they're the only thing each other has, really. So so we've got that, and then it turns in, there's a horror supernatural aspect in the second half that I had a lot of fun writing. And I don't know what kind of category it fits in or anything like that. It started out as a Western, turned into a Western horror story or whatever. But I love writing Westerns. I tend to write either crime or Westerns for the most part. And Westerns are a lot of fun for me. I kind of just let the language eat a little bit and have fun with them. And which I don't do much with crime. With crime, I try to keep it a little bit more between the lines. But with Westerns, I just kind of go with it. So had a lot of fun with that. So anyway, that's a little bit about that. So so now at this point, we've heard from everybody here. I didn't miss anybody, right? I'm hoping. Okay. So we've heard from everybody here. Again, this is the book, Starlite Pulp Review number 3. See it behind Sean. And so at this point, does anybody have any questions, comments, anything else for other authors about what you saw, read, or want to know about from this issue? Phillip?
Yeah, I got a question for Brody about his story, the Locust Eaters. And Brody, just so you know, thank you for mentioning Charles Todd White. I met him a few years ago. I think he's one of the best writing or best working writers anywhere today. He's right here.
Excellent.
And it was just a thrill to actually hear you talk about him. But I read, when I was reading through that, not just because of the preacher that's in the story, but there's definitely a wise blood Flannery feel to that. And I was just wondering how much Flannery O'Connor is in that story, if any, or who else might have influenced the tone of it, because the tone is so gothic when you get right down to it.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And Charles Don White, he was wonderful. I actually had him for 2 courses, one freshman year, one sophomore year. That was the first time I had read Deliverance as well, and super awesome guy. But yeah, I mean, Larry Brown wrote a very rare, a very unknown story called A Gross Resurrection, and I read that, and so there's a little bit of influence there. it's the last story in his complete collection that just came out about 2 or 3 years ago. And as far as the Southern Gothic, I read William Gay just about every day. I reread a lot of his books. I was pretty steeped in Twilight by William Gay. And as far as Flannery, man, when I first read her stuff, I was 27 years old. I came to it late, but as soon as I saw it, I read it. I was like, I grew up with these characters. That woman was in the third pew ahead of me in church. That dude visited our church as a crazy evangelist. Like, I got it, because I lived in that kind of South. So, I a lot of Flannery's female characters can be very strong-willed, and so I think I see that in Levi's mom. Yeah, the reluctance of Levi wanting to go to Johnny's house, although he wants to do the right thing. I can see that in Parker, from Parker's back. He wants to, get that big tattoo on his back, but also please his wife, who he's at odds with. I just read a lot of Southern Gothic, and it just comes out now. Yeah. So, thank you.
Cool.
Thanks.
Trevor, you had a question, I think.
Did you say me?
No, Trevor. Sorry.
Okay.
Oh, I was, Philip, so I was just going to comment how immediately reading Brodie's story, I was going, wow, Flannery, good homage to Flannery O'Connor. I really appreciate it. I liked it a lot.
Well, thank you.
And the second thing came up, Brian, when you were talking about your title. Boy, does that sound like an homage to Cornell Woolrich? So, and I'd say that in a good way. Nice title. So,
Thanks.
Good job. I think you settled on a good one.
Thanks.
And I could go on, but I won't. But thanks.
Absolutely. Anybody else questions? Yes, Manny.
For Brody, as far as the Locust Eater, beautiful story where it transcends the the whole idea of pulp and noir to become like literature. Did you consider making this a novel or extending it in some way?
Well, thanks, Manny. I really appreciate that, man. It's actually a story. It's the last story in my short story collection that my agent's going to be pitching sometime this year. I think it. I thought it does well with a standalone, but I could. So Johnny, okay, so in the collection, Johnny shows up in other stories, and I tie it in. So, I mean, I could eventually write a story that is similar to that in a novel form. Like William Gay with Twilight, with the strong man and and the funeral director going after this brother and sister. I would have a lot of fun with that. So yeah, man, I'd approach it differently. But yeah, there's a lot there, man, and I'd like to explore that more.
Look forward to it if you do.
Well, thank you.
Also, a second thing I wanted to mention to everybody, and this ties in. This is shameless self-promotion, but it also promotes Starlight. So Brian had mentioned earlier the novellas and possible anthology coming out in the fall, and I believe my novella, The Idiot Caper, will be in there. And I have been trying to get that thing published like, once you get published and you get established and you get to know your publishers and you pitch to them and they put your books out and some books get declined. But The Idiot Caper has been a weird one because it almost doesn't, it needs to come out. I think it's one of my best books, which ties in with me mentioning Dead Dogs because I wanted to let Sean know there's dogfighting in this book. If you haven't read it, check it out. It's my first book. And it does tie into the Idiot Caper coming out this year. It's kind of a sideways because all the books are tied in together in the series. They all take place in the same city. Some of them have the same characters. You see the aftermath of certain crimes that happened in those later books. So yeah, I just wanted to mention Dead Dogs and then the upcoming anthology this year, which we'll see more of those characters from Dead Dogs in it. So thank you for giving me the time to.
Yeah, of course. And something I want to piggyback on there, just a moment. So when I grew up, obviously I read, of course, novels like everybody else. And I read, Chandler and Encyclopedia Brown and, Choose Your Own Adventure and everything else. But I also, read a bunch of King, of course, early on. I'm talking, preteen and teenage years. But one of the other things that I really loved at the time were novellas and short stories. I couldn't get enough of short story collections and novellas. And that's part of the reason, of course, why I'm doing what I'm doing now, right? Is I love shorts and I love novellas. And I don't understand why, and Manny just mentioned this, so we can piggyback on it. The concept of big publishers, big five, whatever you want to call them, they will not publish novellas. Like novellas are dead to them. If anything, it'll go in a short story collection by an author that author already has. But that's it. And I love novellas. And I was talking with this at he's not here today, but at the reading last week, Jean-Paul, who runs Space Cowboy Books in Joshua Tree, we were looking at the books on the wall, right? And there's all these great 50s and 60s pulp books, right, that he's got like bagged up on the wall that are fantastic. I swear to God, every single one of those would nowadays be considered a novella. Every one. They're all between 90 and 130 pages. And 3/4, maybe 4/5 of everything Steinbeck ever wrote would now be considered a novella. Of Mice and Men is a novella. That's not a novel. And so it's the weirdest thing to me that if your book isn't like 250 plus pages, publishers won't even look at it. And that just doesn't make any sense to me because like one of my favorite books in the world is Legends of the Fall by Jim Harrison because it has Legends of the Fall, which by the way is a great novella. Think what you want about the movie. I actually like the movie, but whatever. Think what you want about the movie, but the novella is fantastic. But Revenge is also in there. Revenge is a great story. That was also a movie with Anthony Quinn and Kevin Costner and Madeline Stowe that was made in the 80s. It takes place down in Mexico, but that is fantastic. And then there's a third novella. I'm forgetting the title of it, but there's 3 novellas in that, and they're fantastic. And I love novellas. And so the idea here is to focus specifically, for the most part, on collections of short stories and novellas. And so I'm thinking of, like I said, I've got this group of 4, possibly 5 novellas in this book this year. But I'm thinking I might want to do it on a year-to-year basis. So for those of you who are out there who are thinking to yourself, I wrote a novella, I have nowhere to put it, or I want to write a novella, but no one will publish it. If we do this once a year, put out a collection of novellas as well, just know that there's a place to send it. So, all right. Anybody else? Questions, comments? Yes, Patrick.
Yeah, for Jim, how'd you come across Mariana Enriquez?
Oh, that's a good question. I really don't know. I read a lot of work in translation and travel around a lot. My wife is in education and she does professional development. She's a bilingual educator, and so I tag along on a lot of her work trips in different Spanish-speaking countries, and just came back from Chile a few days ago, and so I just get exposed to different writers that way, I suppose. I hope there's not someone who said, Jim, you have to read this. You're gonna love it. Who's cursing me right now because I've forgotten, but I really don't remember. I do know that the horror writer Paul Tremblay speaks very highly of Mariana Enriquez, as particularly Our Share of Night, that big monster novel.
Yeah, it's a great book.
I call it a monster novel. It's not about monsters. It kind of is, but it's just an enormous book. Um, yeah, but you're a big fan of that book too, huh?
Yeah, it's really fucked up and creepy.
And I think a lot of it has to do, like in that part of South America, which I'm don't pretend to understand, but just have a little bit of a reference for, is that some of these stories of possession, these stories of haunted places, are allegories for the unspeakable crimes that happened on behalf of the state during these dictatorships.
Mm.
Places like Argentina and Chile, um, where the police and the secret police and the military were all in cahoots and committed crimes against their own citizens, and just really so many people, a whole generation of people had, grew up with an uncle who disappeared, or an aunt who was in prison, or a dad that never came back, and all those kinds of stories. So I think that a lot of that horror touches on that specifically.
Excellent. Terrence, I think you had a question.
Yeah, I just want to comment, Aaron, I love the fact that Des Moines, Iowa shows up in your story, because I feel like by and large, and we've commented a little bit on this earlier, the whole Midwest, just in general, is like this dead zone of story. So I really did appreciate, since I live in Des Moines, Iowa, seeing that pop up. I'm like, yes, finally someone's talking about this place, because it did exist. It does exist.
Yeah, I actually saw a post the other day. Some of you other guys might have saw. I don't know what it was on or anything, but it was a map of how foreigners see the U.S., and it had the whole West Coast as Los Angeles. It had Texas and Oklahoma as Yeehaw. It had the South as the Deep South, the whole Northeast as New York, and then the whole middle area said where? It's kind of like, yeah, I think that's there's some truth in that.
I was it was kind of exciting to me because you start to wonder, like, what does a place like Des Moines, what does the Midwest, that Midwest, look like in 1870s? You've obviously got big cities, you've already got the West, but what does a place like that look like? And it is kind of a little in between mix of everything. So like getting to know like that is the brewery, I mean, which was called a brewery back then, that's in the novel, was a real place, and to think of people living in that environment was really, really pretty cool. And again, reading news articles and stuff from that area. We went to Iowa like a couple of years ago. I don't know why we take the weirdest road trips, right? One day we were like, let's go to Iowa and see the pickers, and so we did that, and I become more and more appreciative of what that Midwest looks like.
One of the only things I can think of, by the way, it struck me earlier as we were talking about it, when I was talking about Old West and how we ignore the North and the Midwest in general. The one exception I can think of to that for sure, of course, is the James gang and the Doolin Dalton gang, because they were slaughtered up in Minnesota, I believe, and then the James gang had a bank robbery go seriously sideways in Minnesota as well, and both of those that's covered in the Long Riders, the movie The Long Riders by oh geez, what's his name? It'll come to me, but anyway,
Walter Hill.
Walter
yes,
Hill.
thank you, Walter Hill.
The Northville Raid.
Which and the violence that I just watched The Long Riders a couple months ago. It's fun, man. It's really well done, and the Carradine brothers and Keach brothers and all that, just really well done. But yeah, there is that, and then of course Doolin Dalton gang got slaughtered up there. So trying to rob a bank. So yeah, Brody.
Oh yeah, man. So I had a question for Terrence and then you, Brian. Terrence, since you're a Bond fan, What do you think about Christopher Nolan possibly directing a Bond movie? Because it's been floating around for a while.
So I just finished reading a book this last year called The Nolan Variations, and it's basically like a retrospective through Nolan's career to date, which was fascinating. Great book. I was more on board with the idea of him doing a Bond film after reading that because he's a massive Bond fan, and so I feel like he would. The difficulty is Bond films are at their best when they're schlock that is decided by committee and not auteur directors. By and large, that's my philosophy. Best of the Bond films, by and large. Martin Campbell, he is not an auteur director, but he knows how to shoot a damn good action movie.
Yeah.
The flip side is Nolan would probably make theoretically the best Bond film. It would be the Alfred Hitchcock film we never had, that Alfred Hitchcock Bond film, because that was a thing too way back when. So that's my current opinion.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Do you know what Nolan's favorite Bond movie was?
On Her Majesty's Secret Service, I'm pretty certain.
Such a wonderful ending.
Oh, yes. I mean, okay, so this is a slight tangent, but Bond is an underappreciated pulp genre because it fits within noir and the spy genre and this creature horror vibe. Dr. No is basically a Bond film where he's retelling a Greek myth. It's incredible.
I like that. Yeah. And then Brian, you said you enjoy writing Westerns. Did you grow up watching Westerns? And if so, which ones influenced you a lot?
Oh, big time. Yeah, actually, I mean, I'm not going to pretend like this is some massive thing in my life. It's not, but I grew up with it in the sense that my grandpa was a special effects guy, did a lot of special effects for a lot of different movies, did a bunch of John Wayne films, and did the original The Thing, did Green Berets, but also worked suddenly with Sinatra, and knew a lot of those actors, was on set all the time. He was always down in Mexico shooting something, or in some part of California. And yeah, very much so. Both grandmas too that I grew up with when I'd go over to their places and things like that. Huge, like you mentioned earlier, Gunsmoke. Marshall Dillon. Grew up with Marshall Dillon for sure. Gunsmoke fan, and a lot of the old kind of traditional westerns. And then as I got older, certainly the spaghetti westerns, neo westerns, the modern stuff. I'm just a huge fan, just in general, of the western genre. And the funny part is that I honestly feel like it's so underrepresented in so many ways, because I swear to God, I think you could fit about 80 to 90% of Western TV and films into one small telling of the West. And then there's this other 10% that's things like The Revenant, where those should be, there's so many of those stories out there. That's the thing. You don't have to have natives in every story. You don't have to have the sheriffs and the marshals. You don't have to have, there's so many, the homestead, there's so many tellings. And they're starting to come out now. The last decade or so, we're starting to see more movies. There tend to be indie movies that you'll find on streaming services and stuff like that. Tommy Lee Jones has made a few, but just a huge fan just in general. And I really like writing it too. I mean, as much as I love crime, and I do, I've got an Out of the Past poster right behind me. As much as I love crime and noir, and I absolutely do, Westerns, I just feel, are such this iconic American experience that we have to kind of cull from. And then on top of that, when you add in something to the Western, something supernatural or horror or something like that, it makes it so much fun, because we so often expect horror to be, look at 95% of horror films, and they're all, if they come out, it's a movie now, it's present. And there's so much to be told about, a horror film in the 1860s or 70s. I mean, that's just I feel like the possibilities there are just tremendous. So yeah, I love Westerns. I love traditional Westerns, but I also love weird Westerns.
Like That's Craig Zoller's Bone Tomahawk.
Yeah. Oh, Bone Tomahawk is fantastic. Dead Man, the Jim Jarmusch one, where Johnny Depp plays William Blake, and his native partner thinks he's the William Blake, the poet, throughout the entire thing. It's freaking hilarious. But they're just weird, you know. And Iggy Pop's in it, and he plays this weird cross-dressing guy. But that's the thing, is you would get that back then. You would get entire weeks, months where you wouldn't even see anybody else, and you know, you'd get so weird if that were the case, you know. And I don't think that gets explored enough. So, you know, I mean, the stories like Blood Meridian and things like that, love them, absolutely love them. Just like I love, you know, El Dorado by John Wayne, and I love the weird Westerns as well. I just love the whole genre.
I got one docu-series to throw for everyone. Sorry to cut you off, Sean. It's called The Men Who Built America, Frontiersmen. It's a series that follows Daniel Boone, Lewis and Clark, Crockett, Andrew Jackson, and it's a different side of the West, going along, piggybacking on what everyone's saying. It's a different side that we normally don't traditionally see read, but it's really it's cool. It's fascinating stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to mention the Sam Peckinpah show, The Westerner. About 13 episodes. It was a complete show. It's shown up on Tubi. If you guys haven't seen it, check it out. It has like all the tropes and everything that Sam Peckinpah ever did. Like this drunken cowboy just roaming, going town to town with his dog. That's it. And he meets some people. He meets a girl that he loses and all that stuff. But it's fantastic. It's only 13 episodes. They're about 30 minutes each. So I highly recommend it on Tubi for free. So
Joe Lansdale's The Thicket's coming out on Tubi too soon with Peter Dinklage.
Cool. Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to type in on Westerns too. Yeah, Manny, I've watched that. I think it's on YouTube as well. It's Brian Keith plays it. It's amazing. Peckinpah is my favorite Western director. But Brian, I wanted to piggyback on Western and also just thank you for like having a platform for Westerns and some of these pulp stories. There's like not a lot of places to get these plays published. I'm luckily you're around, and we all were able to get something in this great collection. But yeah, Westerns, man. Bone Tomahawk, if you like a little of the horror, it's all good. And I just want to put there is a character that is in my story Pit that's named Dub Bedecker. And it's a play on a famous Western B director named Bud Bedecker. If you ever watched any of his movies, Bud Bedecker B Westerns are great. So Westerns. All right.
You know, one of the things that I find so interesting too is that if you look back through the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, even some of the 60s, Westerns were probably the most popular form of storytelling that we had in America. And for whatever reason that left, but not only did it leave, there's almost a sense of scorn on a lot of it from modern critics and things like that. Like the John Wayne Westerns stuff, they're looked at as like this anachronism from another time entirely. And I get that to a certain degree. I get it. The tropes, certainly the lack of any kind of diversity just at all in the majority of the films, that sucks. That's a bummer. I totally get that. But at the same time, it's super weird to me because we, just like we do with so many things in our culture, we go from one side of the pendulum to the other, right? Way too far the other way. And all of a sudden you can't get a Western story published. I mean, I remember doing this. I'll get to you in one sector. I remember writing a Western story a few years ago, and it was actually the first Rye Lonehand story. Had a blast doing it. It was called The Ghost of All Goodbyes, and finally got it published. It published it in Frontier Tales, and it won Story of the Month or something like that at the time. But it was like 3 or 4 years ago. But I remember just being shocked at how hard it was to just find a place to publish a Western. And that's crazy to me because we, again, 30, 40 years ago, we had too many. And now all of a sudden, and so I wanted to absolutely, when we started Starlite, that was one of the things when I was talking with the other guys who I work with, is this, I want this to be a priority. Like crime, absolutely. Westerns, yes. Horror, yes. Sci-fi, yes. Fantasy, weirdly, it's super weird, but we don't really get any fantasy. So I mean, I suppose we'd publish it, but we just don't get the submissions. But that was like a priority from day one, because it really was annoying to me that I'm sure there are awesome writers out there writing good Westerns, and there's just nowhere to publish them. And it was the weirdest thing. Trevor?
Yeah, quick interjection about piggybacking on what Sean was talking about and the John Waynes and so on. Mid 1960s, beautiful novel written, was probably a good 20th century follow-up to 19th century Huckleberry Finn. It was in a lot of school curriculums, etc. True Grit, Charles Portis,
Yeah,
who is one of the most wonderful writers I've ever read. But the movie came out with John Wayne, and it was dropped from curriculums, right? So I don't know, it's not there. It's not there, but it's a wonderful view of the West from the girl's perspective. Does it take place in like Fort Smith, Arkansas? You northwest.
It does, yeah. Portis was. Portis was.
Yeah, Portis was from. Yeah. He was from northwest. He was an Arkansas guy.
Yeah.
Anyway, just wanted to point out Earl Blevins in my story. I took the name Blevins from in Holbrook, Arizona. There was a law officer in the 1870s named Commodore Perry Owens. Basically slaughtered a household full of people by the name of Blevins. So that was my nod to the Old West with that story, and it's tied into another Western that I wrote. But it was a genre I'd never thought to write in, and quite frankly, I found out I really like it a lot. Particularly the neo westerns. I mean, the No Country for Old Men. I like the book. I mean, I love the movie, but then I read the book and I thought, oh man, even more so. I like it even more so. So that's my little add-in. But about True Grit, I mean, that book bears looking at more than once, as do all of his five, six published books.
Yeah, and
it's wonderful.
And the remake I thought was pretty decent with Jeff Bridges and the Coen brothers.
Yeah, it looked like the dialogue might have been more they had Maddie's words from the book.
Yeah, true to the book. Yeah, no, I agree. Phillip?
Yeah, you're sort of talking about the sort of disappearance of Westerns, and yeah, maybe the straight up gunslinger stuff, especially in TV and movies. But I think the essence of the Western, the story is still there, and it overlaps into crime fiction so much. I think it does. I mean, not to get all Clint Eastwoody, but Dirty Harry is really a Western. And you can just sort of carry that through. I've heard arguments, good reasoned arguments, that Star Wars is a Western, or Blade Runner, and it's because you're looking for certain elements, not necessarily tropes, but there are some. But the elements and the structure of the story, it's kind of uniquely American in the way we view what we want to consume as readers. We want a hero or an anti-hero. We want that good versus bad, and it definitely seems to translate really well. I don't consider myself to be a Western writer, but the weird thing is, my books managed to sell as Westerns, and people have come up to me and say, "Yeah, I read your book and it was a Western and I love it." Like, look, I don't write Westerns, but it translates that way.
That's hilarious, Phillip, because I actually have had a similar thing, because I've written two Sonny Haynes books, which take place in 1950, and I think of them as crime novels. They're very much, in my mind, crime novels. But I had James Whelpley, he wrote the introduction for Trunk Full of Zeros that just came out, and in the introduction he said he literally wrote, "This may as well be a Western, and Sonny's Merc may as well be a horse waiting outside for him." And I was like, oh, okay, like I hadn't even thought about that. But yeah, it's fun. But I think so much of that is because we grew up with it and it resonates with us. Like you said, a lot of those tropes, a lot of those ideas, that we see even in modern crime and noir are very just they stem from a lot of the Western stories that we grew up with.
It seems to be a mindset. It definitely translates over into quite a few genres actually.
Yeah.
I
Terrence?
mean, The Mandalorian is totally a Western.
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
without
definitely.
question. Oh, it's a space Western. Yeah. No doubt. No
I
doubt.
was just gonna comment. One of the books I read this last year that actually made like my top 5. It was that good. Stardust Trail by J.R. Sanders.
Yeah.
It's a PI novel, but
Mhm.
set in that 1940s when Hollywood's still making Westerns.
Right.
And there's very much this interesting subtext text where you see the PI have to kind of be a cowboy and work with cowboys. And you see just very starkly that transition of the cowboy hat becomes the fedora, which I thought was really cool in that story.
And you know, the JR, I met him a couple times. Saw him at BoucherCon this last year, and also I went to one of his early book signings at a Barnes and Noble a couple years ago just to introduce myself. And he actually is a ex-law enforcement, but he's actually he also used to write for, and I'm gonna get the magazine wrong, so but it might be True West magazine or it's an Old West magazine. He used to write nonfiction stories for about the Old West for the magazine. And so he really kind of has a very kind of encyclopedic knowledge of that stuff. He actually sent a nonfiction story to me to get published, and it was interesting. And it's on a bicycle thief. I think it was in Idaho or something, on a bicycle thief. But it just, I mean, we don't really do nonfiction, so it just, yeah, he definitely has. And you see a lot of that when you see like take, for example, take Legends of the Fall. Think Legends of the Fall. And the reason I say that is because that's right at this great time in American history where it's not the Old West anymore. Right. And that takes place, I believe, in Montana, if I'm not mistaken. But it's like 1918. So it's right around World War I. So it's like 1917 and 1922, something like that. And it's not the Old West per se, because people are driving around in cars, but it's still very much the Old West, if you know what I mean. And it's like the birth of the crime era, because you have the mob starting to make inways and things like that. But at the same time, everything looks still very Old West. So it's a really interesting time period that and JR knows that stuff pretty well. Yes, Brody.
I just, you had mentioned The Revenant, and I remember when my brother and I watched that in theaters, and one scene that always stuck out to me as far as just real reaction was near the end when DiCaprio's character cuts off Tom Hardy's finger. Most actors would be like, ah, but Tom Hardy goes like, which is the real reaction, because it's cold, your adrenaline's going, and it's not going to feel as painful. And man, like that was such a great fight scene.
It's a great fight scene. It's a brutal fight scene, but it's a great fight scene. Yeah.
Yeah.
Manny? I'll get you, Alex.
I mean, I don't want to turn this into a Walter Hill discussion, but I just want to mention that personally, Walter Hill, when I was a kid, I was about 5 years old. My parents took me to see The Getaway, which has resonated with me forever. That's like that and everything below it. Like there was no Luke Skywalker. There couldn't be Luke Skywalker after Steve McQueen for me as a kid.
Mhm.
But Walter Hill wrote that script. He was a kind of an assistant director to Sam Peckinpah. But I wanted to mention him because everything he's ever made, whether it's a Western or not, in fact, when it's not a Western, it's a Western. And he did, he remade Yojimbo as The Last Man Standing, which takes place in Prohibition era, if I remember correctly.
But it's in the Old West town.
But yeah, and it's a Western, and it's weird because again, no cowboy hats, but fedoras. So yeah, that's the perfect idea. And I don't, it doesn't matter what you're writing or what era you're writing in. I think you're just, if it's going to be noir, it's going to be action or something. It's always going to be a Western, no matter what. The Michael Mann movie Heat, a Western, it's a big bank robbery movie.
It's a great movie. Yeah.
So yeah, I think what I'm trying to say is we'll always have Westerns, and that'll always be the well that we go to draw for these stories, for these crime stories. So
yeah. Alex, let's go over to you. And Manny, by the way, Sean just dropped something in the chat box for you.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to ask something, but first I'll just make a comment to add to the Western discussion, which is it's interesting you mentioned The Getaway also, Manny, because like that stands out to me as a perfect fusion of a Western and a crime crime story. And I just finished reading She Rides Shotgun by Jordan Harper, and I think it's like an amazing book. And as I was reading it, I was like, this is noir through and through, but the Western influence is undeniable, and also a little bit of that samurai, like a lone wolf and cub kind of feel. And it sort of stoked that feeling of like, everything is like a Western through line kind of runs through everything, and it's so tied in with crime. And there is something that that I think people, especially readers and viewers, can really like identify with. It really sticks with them. I just wanted to ask very quickly, and this is more of an open question, because after reading through everything in the review and noticing and talking with you guys both in Joshua Tree and here, I'm noticing that there's a few trends. One is that things kind of arc a little darker. The other is that some of our stories evolved and changed, or changes happened as we were writing them. Like in Snowbird, I at a certain point realized there's something a little bit that's like The Professionals, and I'm going to need another character. And Brian, you mentioned like yours started as a Western, it became horror. Terrence, yours was spy infused, and then it became a fairy tale. I just wondered if anybody else wanted to throw in there, as you're writing stuff, like what did you experience a drastic change that changed the story for you, that shifted things?
I'll go if no one else will. Mine was Brian's notes, which he said you should probably stick to. I'm paraphrasing. You should probably keep it more lighter to match we'll call the beginning part 1 and the ending part 2. When I did a rewrite, that I kept that in mind the whole time. So I guess that's the opposite of the whole darkness approach.
Well, I'll tell you what, and anybody feel free to jump in on this anytime. But one thing that with some of the podcasts I've had, I find it interesting because I'm always talking to these other authors, and some of them are so interesting because they will plot out everything. Like James Ellroy, for example, is one of those guys who's known to like, Owen King, when he was on the podcast, mentioned that he had an experience where he read something where Ellroy's outline was about the length of his novel. Now that's, to me personally, that's crazy. Like for some people that might make sense. To me, that's absolutely nuts, because half the time when I go into a scene, sometimes the scene changes. Like sometimes something happens and I go, you know what? How about if and so to have everything planned out like that, and obviously it works for Ellroy, who's a master, no doubt about it. It's just, that's an interesting way to go about it, because some authors start with a scene and they go, you know what, I'm gonna go here, I'm gonna see what happens. Others are very this is what happens, then this, right? And if they don't get to C, they don't know how. They have to go through A and B to get to C, and if those don't go in order, that it hasn't gone the way they thought, right? So everybody works differently that way, and that's one of the amazing parts about what we do, right? Is we're literally creating something from nothing, and that's why it's so crazy cool when it works, because it didn't exist before, and we made it exist with these characters that don't exist in a town that, or a place that might have existed, might not have, and that's all crazy. But the fact of the matter is, we all work differently, and so I don't know about you guys. It'd be interesting to hear, but everybody does that differently. Some people plot out everything beforehand, and other people are like, I have an outline, let's see what happens, right? So
I use an outline that becomes more of a treatment. Now you'll think I'm crazy, Brian. And the outline can run a few pages. Now, once I do that, I've got the overarching architecture. Now, inside the scene, absolutely, stuff changes. I've written myself into a hole way too many times. And I've learned that the outline is my friend. I used to never write an outline. I would sit down in front of a blank screen or a blank notebook and say, wherever this goes is where it goes. But then I, wrote myself into a hole and found it very difficult to get out of it. A to B to C, sure, but there might be some, A.1, A.2 before I get to B and C. So yeah, it really depends on what you're most comfortable with, I think.
Sean?
Yeah, I was gonna say, I'm fairly new to short story writing. I've written screenplays. I did that for like 12 years. And with short stories, I don't outline as much. I have ideas. And like with Pitt, like I said, I knew I wanted to capture the world of cockfighting. I just didn't know how to tell an intriguing story with a little twist. But what came to me was one day I read a novel by Sean Crosby. He goes by S.A. Crosby. It's called Blacktop Wasteland. And it starts out the first chapter. The protagonist is like in this drag race with this monumental braggart dick. And then that's what gave me the story. I'm like, okay, I just need, in this cockfighting story, I just need a dick to kind of like thrust the beginning, and then he gets his comeuppance. And that's what really did it for me. But with novels, yeah, I outline, I want to have the whole story. When I write a screenplay, I have the whole story. Short stories, it just sort of just comes, and I like to whip them out. It's really fun writing short stories. I'll continue to do it, and maybe a novella for it.
Yeah. Jim, let's go to you real quick, and then Manny, and then we'll wrap it up here.
Yeah, well, not to sound like a recovering alcoholic and addict, which I am, but like I just find that whatever works tends not to work for very long. So whether if it's a outline, then like I find that stops working at some point, or if I just go by the seat of my pants, that'll stop working. And whether it's like I'm going to write in my office after work and sleep in the cube on the floor, that stops working, thank God. I mean, it just if it just kept working, I'd probably still be doing all those things, but I've just learned to be more less romantic about what my view of how something should be done, and just get it done. Because now that I'm 55 years old, I don't have like a lot of time to dick around. I don't have like my 20s where I was writing novels that just went on and on and on for 5, 6, 7, 10 years, and I don't have that anymore. I want to get stuff done, so I just try to be as adaptable as possible and go with what works.
Yeah, excellent. Manny?
As far as the writing approach, I've been asked that a few times, like, do you outline, do you blah, blah, blah. And you remember that scene in the movie, The Dark Half, not the book, the movie, where he lapses into his writing and he gets the pencil and the paper, and he's just like, oh, he's like in a trance, or he's out of it. If I don't achieve that when I'm writing a novel, then I know it's not going to be good. Really, every single one of my novels. And there are times I found one novel that I don't remember writing at all. I'm like, what is this? So for me, it's to get into that state of, I don't want to say trance, but it's that just inundating myself in there and just not coming out until it's done, and probably not remembering it, because then I go back and edit it. I'm like, I don't remember writing it. So for me, it's a spiritual and a transcendental thing, as corny as that sounds. So yeah.
It does sound corny, but it's totally true too, because I had somebody a while back tell me that recite to me their favorite line from a story I wrote, and I looked at them and I said, I didn't write that. And then they showed it to me, and it was in the story, and I was like, oh shit. Yeah. So yeah. So I mean, it happens. You get into not a lapse, but it's almost like a trance, like you mentioned, where you're just piping it, you're just pumping it out, and it just, whatever happens, and that's what editing is for. But but a lot of times it's good when you're in that. So all right, guys, we're gonna go ahead and finish it up. You guys have been awesome. This is all these guys, every single one of these gentlemen here is in Starlite Pulp Review number 3, available at starlightpulp.com, as well as most of the other book sites you can go to. And highly encourage you to go pick one up. And if you do, please leave a review. One thing that we don't talk about much, but that is really important, is when you go to an Amazon, or you go to Barnes & Noble, you go to bookshop.org, you go to Goodreads, those reviews that you leave really do matter. So obviously, for multiple reasons, everybody here hopes that they're positive reviews. But the point is that the reviews matter, because other people look at them and decide whether to take a chance on a book, oftentimes based on those reviews. So if you do pick it up, if you leave a review, that would be awesome. You guys who have got here with me, you guys have been awesome. I appreciate each and every one of you. Hope to see more of your work in the future. And I am always available on Instagram, as well as you can email me. I do almost all the social media for Starlite, and I'm the one that responds to the emails as well. There are 4 or 5 of us here in Starlite, but we all kind of compartmentalize and do our own thing. So I handle most of that side of things. So if you do write to me, it'll be me you're getting. So feel free to do that, and I would love to hear from you guys. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Great, thank you.
In this top secret